So while I was on vacation, I took an opportunity to dig through some old Calvin and Hobbes cartoons. And there was one cartoon that I ran into that reminded me of this text, or at least when I was looking over this text this past week, it brought back that memory of that cartoon. Some of you may remember it. You know, Calvin has this little time machine that he likes to ride around in and go. Usually it's going back in time. He hasn't done any kind of future thing or anything like that, but he likes to go back in time. However, this one time, he was sitting there frustrated with this writing assignment he had to do. He had to write a story. And so he was starting to think. He thought, you know what? My future self will have this assignment done already. I'm just going to go to the future and get that assignment and then bring it back to the past, and then I'll be done and I can mess around for the rest of the night. Okay. So Calvin convinces Hobbes to jump into his time machine, and they go all the way from 6:30 to 8:30. And he finds a Calvin who's in pajamas ready to go to sleep. And so 6:30 Calvin says, all right, where is the homework? I'm going to take it back with me. 8:30 Calvin says, that's what I went 2 hours ago to go get, and I didn't get it. So this argument starts happening between the 6:30 and 8:30 Calvin, and the 6:30 Hobbes stays with the 8:30 Hobbes, as then the 6:30 and 8:30 Hobbes go back to 7:30, and pretty soon now you have an argument of all three of these Calvins arguing over it. And then they come out to this one point where one of the Calvins says, so whose fault is it that this is not done? All three of them go in a triangle and say, him. This is what's happening in this Genesis story. We hear this story. This is right after Adam and Eve have taken of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so they take this fruit, being tempted by the snake, and they eat it. And so now they're hiding. They are hiding from God, who is now walking through the Garden of Eden, calling out to them. The text goes, they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. Sounds like kind of a peaceful walk. I kind of like God's perspective. That's a good time to go for a walk. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man and said to him, where are you? They were hiding. They knew that they had sinned, that they had turned away from God. And so they were hiding. Just like the way we like to hide our sin. It's never that we come out and blatantly say that we have sinned. We like to hide it at first. But then finally someone exposes it to us, and now we know that we are in trouble. So what's the next option? What do we do when we're exposed with being in trouble? Well, we blame it on the other guy, which is what Adam and Eve did. Adam says, this woman that you God gave to me, made me eat it. It's not my fault. Matter of fact, I'm not even really blaming it on her. I'm blaming it on you, God. It's all your fault that I have turned away from you, God. Eve then talks and says, the serpent, he made me do it. You can almost see Calvin standing there with his 7:30 and 8:30 self, pointing that finger in a triangle. It is his fault. It is her fault. It is its fault. God, it's your fault. It's not quite a triangle. It's more of like a rectangle in this case, but you guys get the point. The thing is that we play this blame game. We are constantly blaming others for the things that we do, because we don't like to be the ones in trouble. We don't like to be under scrutiny. We don't like to be told, you're a sinner. You have done wrong. And the thing is, we sin all the time. Romans 5 says, we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. We know this. And how do we act with it? Always blame it on the other guy. We always point the finger. Sorry, Katie, I'm not pointing at you. We always point at the other guy and say, it is his fault. It is her fault. And then sometimes we have the tenacity to even say, God, it is your fault. It is your fault that I have turned away. It is your fault that I have sinned, which logically doesn't make any sense, but that's just what we do. When we turn away from God, we turn away from the reality of how God had created us. God did not create us to point fingers, but instead created us to be in relationship with one another. As soon as we start pointing the finger, we start dehumanizing the other person, looking at them in regards to our own sin, rather, because we're taking that sin and putting it on to this other person. Scapegoating. We all know what that is like. We always like to blame someone else for the problems that exist in this world. It's never us. It is never me that does anything wrong. It is never me who votes in a way that causes destruction in this world. It's never me who in my daily activities cause poverty and destruction in this world. It is never me who even by not smiling at a person causes pain in that life. Even in the smallest little things that we have within our lifetime, those are the things that we can still cause destruction, chaos, and death. The thing is, though, how did God respond to all this? In this story, God instead responds to the snake and punishes the snake. And if we were to read further, I don't understand why we cut off only at the snake's punishment, but it goes further to say the woman would have pains in childbearing, the man would be having to till the lands by the sweat and blood of his hands. You guys have heard that story. But the thing is, it stops right there, but the thing is we all deal with that now. It brings into the reality the consequences of what our sin does. Our sin causes pain, causes destruction, causes chaos. This is not really what God is doing to them. God did not really punish the snake, but instead just said the reality of what the snake's sin was going to be. Let me actually read for you further what it says. To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. And to the man he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree that I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of all the days of your life. God is actually not punishing in this particular text. God is instead saying, here's what your sin has led to in this world. Your sin has brought even pain to creation itself. You guys read in, I believe it's 1 Corinthians, there is this text where Paul says, all of creation cries out in birthing pains for the resurrection. All of creation suffers because of the sin of humanity, because of the sin that we all have. So this part of the text is not a punishment. This is not what God's response is to all this. What is God's response to our sin? What is God's response to the destruction we cause? What is God's response for our eternal strive to bring more chaos into this world? By dying on the cross. This is where God went with our sin. God became incarnate in Jesus Christ, walked among us, preached that we were created for love and relationship with one another, that God's original intention for you was love and freedom from sin and death. And because we did not like that message, we killed him. Sinning again, turning away from God, turning away from what God had made for us. The thing is that God said, my forgiveness is more powerful than your own sin. You may kill me, but I will rise again in 3 days. And Jesus did that. Jesus rose from the grave. Jesus returned to this world, and God glorified him. This was God's response to sin, death, and destruction and chaos. What we kill, what we bring destruction to, God instead lifts up in new life. Out of death comes new life. Out of destruction, God makes new life. Out of chaos, God brings in the order of life. This is the hopeful message that we have. This is God's response to our sin. God saw each and every one of you in your sin, and instead of throwing lightning bolts from the sky, instead of smiting you with God's wrath, God instead responded with, I forgive you. I think the acolytes are really getting into it. They're starting to do my hand motions with me. Sorry, guys, I had to tease you a little bit. God has freed each and every one of you for new life. You have been killed by your sin, but God instead raises you up into new life so that you can live as God had intended you to live, the very moment that God had created any of us. God had created you for love for the neighbor, for love with God. And in that freedom, you are now free to live in love with God and with the neighbor.